Welcome to some very famous people you've never really heard of. Bite-sized biographies of the famous, the infamous, and the quirky in less than an hour. My name is Philip D. Gibbons, and there is more information about me, this podcast, and a bibliography at someveryfamouspeople.com. There are also photographs of many of the individuals and items mentioned in this podcast. At the conclusion of Part 2 of this presentation, there will be additional suggestions concerning further information about today's subject, Theodore Roosevelt, 26th President of the United States. Now let's continue with our story about Theodore Roosevelt. Initially, Roosevelt reassured the public and the power brokers behind McKinley's administration that he would respect the goals and attitudes of his predecessor. He maintained the same cabinet members and relied heavily on the advice of his longtime friend and political ally, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge. Cautious at first, he still believed that he could bypass the powerful members of the Senate who maintained many of the unethical political patronage practices that he attempted to do away with while governor of New York. As U.S. senators were still appointed by state legislatures and not as of yet popularly elected, their careers were tied to maintaining a powerful legislative machine in their home states, an organization tied to patronage appointees who contributed money and turned out votes. Roosevelt cautiously began the process of reform in the South with appointments of individuals as a result of merit, including several black individuals. He socialized openly with famed black educator Booker T. Washington, going so far as to invite Washington to dinner at the White House. Roosevelt figured that with a Deep South that was staunchly Democratic and still seething about the party of Lincoln, he was not risking political support. Still, this novel approach generated great hostility from Southerners, Southern politicians, and journalists alike. Roosevelt avoided any subsequent invitations, but expanded his attitudes on patronage nationally. Roosevelt also was determined to actually enforce the provisions of the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 that outlawed corporate monopolies, but was mostly ignored. Business tycoons amassing great fortunes through illegal corporate practices and securities manipulation. In 1902, he took on one of America's largest trusts, as large companies were known in the early 20th century, the Northern Securities Corporation, a network of railroads in the western region of the country, alleging price fixing and other monopolistic practices that were in violation of the law. Roosevelt also ignored J.P. Morgan's attempt to address the matter privately via a face-to-face meeting behind closed doors. Such practices exactly what the president abhorred as an example of favoritism at the expense of the public. 2 years later, the Supreme Court agreed with the president, and Northern Securities was ordered dissolved, and its three main railroads were in future to be operated independently. Some of the financiers involved, including J.P. Morgan and E.H. Harriman, were outraged at this result, but the public and press approved, one journalist commenting, "Wall Street is paralyzed at the thought that a president of the United States would sink so low as to try and enforce the law." During the remainder of the Roosevelt administration, 44 similarly successful antitrust cases were brought, reshaping the Gilded Age mentality that preceded Roosevelt's progressive approach. Roosevelt's Department of Justice also filed restraint of trade lawsuits against some of America's largest industrial giants, including Standard Oil, the American Tobacco Company, Union Pacific Railroad, and meatpacker Swift and Company. Roosevelt inherited a foreign policy problem in the Philippines, where American refusal to end its occupation when the colony was seized from Spain sparked a violent insurrection, led by Philippine rebel Emilio Aguinaldo. This conflict lasted for 3 years, resulted in 4,200 American and 20,000 Filipino military casualties and 200,000 civilian deaths, mostly from disease. Although the conflict started during the McKinley administration, Roosevelt faced both international and domestic criticism, atrocities committed by U.S. troops, many against civilians, and in opposition to perceived American imperialism, was used by Democrats to criticize the president. This conflict would last until July of 1902, dissipating after Aguinaldo's capture. Although some rebels continued sporadic resistance, most ceased hostilities and pledged allegiance to the United States. Although today it would probably be viewed as an imperialist power grab employing less than democratic methods, President Roosevelt became eager to pursue the construction of a Latin American canal, most likely through Panama. As Panama was actually part of Colombia, a country that was unwilling to allow a canal enabling American acquisition in Panama, the U.S. government then employed military intervention to achieve its aims. When Panama declared itself an independent country on November 3, 1903, the U.S. government quickly recognized the new regime and signed a treaty paying $10 million for a perpetual lease of a piece of land that was eventually declared the Canal Zone. The presence of the U.S. Navy, American infantry in Panama, and some liberally distributed payoffs to Colombian military officials on the ground ensured that the transaction endured, and Colombia was unable to regain control of its former province. Although a previous French-financed effort to build such a canal failed spectacularly, Roosevelt and others were convinced that such a canal could be built, and he ignored any criticism, both foreign and domestic, concerning what was essentially gunboat diplomacy. While the eventual 10-year construction of the canal was considered one of the world's great engineering feats, American control of both the land of the Canal Zone and the canal itself became a major issue in Panama, as well as Latin America, for much of the 20th century. It was not until 1999 that the Panama Canal officially reverted back to the country of Panama. As the election year of 1904 approached, Theodore Roosevelt considered his re-election campaign with the same zeal he brought to any major endeavor. He wanted to establish himself electorally in his own right, and not just as an accidental president. Renominated without any opposition, privately many other Republicans were not as enthusiastic about his progressive accomplishments, adopting a vague party platform that allowed the moneyed interests to contribute to the party's national campaign, frequently without Roosevelt's knowledge. The Democrats, unwilling to again nominate William Jennings Bryan, reverted back to a centrist New York Supreme Court Justice, Alton Parker. As a judge, Parker had zero experience with the demands and logistics of a national campaign and initially opted for the front porch approach. Unfortunately, his mansion, known as Rosemount, was in Esopus, near the Hudson River, in rural upstate New York, and very few citizens made the journey to hear what he had to say. Roosevelt remaining on his front porch at his home, Sagamore Hill, situated in way more accessible Oyster Bay, Long Island, New York. Realizing that he needed to increase his profile among the voters, Parker eventually made several public speeches in the Northeast, mostly criticism of Roosevelt as not as aggressive against trust and corporations as the president maintained, and alleging that the Republican campaign was actually financed by big business, a charge Roosevelt vigorously denied. Parker's approach failed badly, the incumbent winning re-election in an unprecedented electoral landslide, getting 336 votes, easily exceeding the required 239, the first candidate ever to receive over 300 electoral votes. Roosevelt's 18.8 popular vote margin, unmatched since the 1820 re-election of James Monroe. It turned out that up to $2 million was contributed to Roosevelt's campaign by magnates such as J.P. Morgan and steel baron Henry Frick, based upon campaign managers' vague promises that Roosevelt would tone down his more progressive instincts once he was safely reelected. When the president reiterated his commitment to progressive ideals in his victory speech and subsequent interactions with Congress, a chagrined Frick uttered the memorable comment, "We bought the son of a bitch, and then he didn't stay bought." Roosevelt's first major effort of his second term to rein in big business resulted in the Hepburn Act in 1906, enabling the Interstate Commerce Commission to set rates for railroads and rid the railroad industry of the rebate system, which allowed lower prices to larger customers. The railroads frequently working in conjunction with the coal and steamship companies they also owned, allowing them to limit competition from smaller businesses and dictate prices to farmers and consumers. For the first time, the U.S. government had the power to manage one of the country's major industries. In the same year, prompted by the journalism of Upton Sinclair, whose description of the horrid conditions prevailing in Chicago's meatpacking industry shocked the nation and the government, Roosevelt signed into law the Pure Food and Drug Act, which established the Food and Drug Administration and was the first attempt to impose reasonable and healthy standards on the foods and pharmaceuticals that Americans regularly consumed. Roosevelt then tackled immigration, passing the Naturalization Act, which regulated immigration in a way that ensured that immigrants to the country would be able to positively contribute to American society. He also did not want the U.S. to be swamped by a tidal wave of humanity that would depress wages and allow entry to individuals he deemed unfit, either morally, physically, or mentally. Roosevelt's second term also underlined the president's unwavering interest in conservation, wildlife, and the outdoors, developed early in life when he spent time as a rancher in the Dakotas. Although President Ulysses S. Grant established the first national park, Yellowstone, in 1872, only a total of 4 national parks were established in the 30 years before Roosevelt's tenure. He created 5 national parks, including Crater Lake and Mesa Verde, and also established 4 national monuments, including the Devil's Tower and the Petrified Forest. These national monuments enabled by the 1906 Antiquities Act, which gave the president executive power to implement designations of areas deemed a crucial part of the nation's heritage. Roosevelt was greatly influenced by conservationists like John Muir and Gifford Pinchot, the president appointing the latter to head the newly created U.S. Forest Service, an agency formed in 1905 to acquire, preserve, and manage forested land owned by the federal government. Previously, private interests had accessed and exploited timber, water, and grasslands for their own economic gain, the government now intending to manage or even restrict such access. 1905 also presented Roosevelt with an opportunity to further amplify the United States' role as an international power. In 1904, war had broken out between Japan and Tsarist Russia, mostly over both countries' attempts to expand their influence over regions in both China and Korea. By 1905, Russia had suffered several military setbacks, culminating in the disastrous naval battle of Tsushima, in which the Russian Navy was virtually destroyed, the country militarily humiliated. Although Japan had achieved military success, the economic demands of the war also prompted them to attempt to negotiate a peaceful resolution to this conflict, the country verging on bankruptcy. Both nations accepted Roosevelt's offer to discuss a potential peace treaty. Diplomats from both countries meeting at Portsmouth, New Hampshire in the summer of 1905 to avoid the sweltering heat of the American capital. While the negotiations were contentious over several fundamental issues, Roosevelt proved to be a skillful arbiter who eventually got both countries to sign what became known as the Treaty of Portsmouth. Japan was able to retain much of the territory acquired during the conflict. Russia was able to avoid both complete international humiliation and the financial indignity of payments of reparations. For his efforts, Theodore Roosevelt was awarded the 1906 Nobel Peace Prize, the first American president to receive the award, as well as the first American to receive this honor in any field. Even more remarkable was that he never left his Sagamore Hill home, communicating with diplomats and even both the Emperor of Japan and the Tsar of Russia through cables, telegrams, and face-to-face meetings in Oyster Bay. In light of his remarkable achievements, it is not surprising that Roosevelt spent the last 2 years of his presidency tangling with Congress over even more progressive regulation of big business and finance. However, even his own party was unwilling to enable further restraint. By late 1907, Roosevelt began to consider his own political future and how he could protect the many legislative gains of his presidency. Following his landslide victory in 1904, Roosevelt immediately announced that he would not seek a third term in 1908. Technically, he had not served 2 full 4-year terms, but so politically embedded was the traditional embargo on a 3-term president that Roosevelt did not want to stir up potential controversy. Instead, he began to ruminate over who he could help get elected to protect his legacy. Ultimately, he selected William Howard Taft. Taft had served ably in Roosevelt's administration, first as the governor of the Philippines during the difficult years of rebellion, and then as the Secretary of War, today known as the Secretary of Defense, and among the most prominent cabinet positions. After Roosevelt went public with his choice, Taft was nominated on the first ballot at the Republican National Convention in the summer of 1908. During the campaign, Taft promised to adhere to the policies of his predecessor, and he was probably fortunate that the Democrats decided to run William Jennings Bryan for a third time, his populist message now wearing thin, especially in light of Roosevelt's progressive policies. Taft won a huge electoral and solid popular vote victory. Republicans retained both houses of Congress, a tribute to Roosevelt's immense political popularity. Shortly after Taft's inauguration, believing that a smooth transition was now guaranteed, Roosevelt sailed for Africa in a 1-year safari hunting big game. Accompanied by his son Kermit and an entourage of naturalists, friends, and even a surgeon, it was the obviously appropriate retirement venture for such a youthful and vigorous individual. Unfortunately for the wildlife of Africa, Roosevelt subscribed to the now antiquated perspective that big game was to be hunted, killed, and collected in as great a number as possible. Between him and his son Kermit, they shot and killed over 500 mammals, including numerous lions, hippopotamuses, rhinoceroses, elephants, zebras, giraffes, and buffaloes. His naturalist cohort from the Smithsonian eagerly harvested thousands of other species of various magnitudes. At least this aspect of the Great Safari justified along the lines of research and exploration. Roosevelt specifically avoided any publicity while on this journey, intent on writing his own account upon his return. The book, eventually entitled African Game Trails, was published in 1910. Roosevelt spent most of 1909 in Africa, not leaving the continent until March of 1910. He then met up with his wife and toured various European cities, receiving an honorary degree at Cambridge, lecturing on biology at Oxford, and was received by numerous heads of state and dignitaries, including Austria's Franz Josef, Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II, and Great Britain's King George V. Theodore Roosevelt returned to the United States at the height of his national popularity. A massive crowd greeted him in New York City, over 1 million spectators turning out on June 18, 1910, for the first ticker-tape parade in the history of the city. Roosevelt was joined by over 100 Rough Riders, various police and army units, and military bands providing a hero's welcome. But Roosevelt's personal outlook on the American political scene he left behind put him on a collision course with President Taft. While in Europe, he had already received letters and updates from close friends and associates that Taft was not aggressively pursuing some of the actions that Roosevelt routinely employed, especially in dealing with major industries and conservation issues. The ex-president waited until late summer to actively re-enter the political scene. on August 23rd, he boarded a train at New York's Grand Central Terminal, intent on a speaking tour of 15 states. With the midterms approaching and Republicans on the defensive after Taft's less than impressive tenure, it was believed that Roosevelt was intent on shoring up Republican Party candidates in the upcoming election. What ensued was something far different. In Denver on August 29th, he gave a speech focusing on numerous recent Supreme Court decisions he considered a step backwards in terms of fair regulation of corporations and the ability of, quote, lawless men of great wealth, unquote, to evade legal responsibility. On October 31st, and of all places, Osawatomie, Kansas, a site associated with radical anti-slavery insurrectionist John Brown, Roosevelt delivered an even more provocative address on something he described as the new nationalism. He proclaimed that this manifesto required the federal government act as arbiter of the common good, focused on stopping abuses of the privileged powerful, and should behave as a protector and benefactor of the ordinary citizen. He demanded the imposition of an income tax with the greatest impact on higher incomes, an estate tax on great fortunes, intelligent management of natural resources and wildlife, workmen's compensation, child labor reform, greater regulatory government powers to curb corporate abuses, the removal of corporate political campaign contributions, transparency of personal political contributions, and personal legal liability for directors of corporations that broke the law. Especially in 1910, this was a radical perspective, an extreme for a Republican Party that embraced Roosevelt's populism while he was president, but was now about to split between progressives like Roosevelt and more mainstream party members that favored the status quo and advocated for the enormously wealthy tycoons that dominated the party until Roosevelt's ascension. Even longtime Republican allies like Henry Cabot Lodge, although cordial, broke with Roosevelt, considering his stance to be excessive to a dangerous degree. The midterms were a predictable rout, and many incumbent congressional candidates that Roosevelt supported were defeated, the Democrats seizing control of the House for the first time in 16 years. Suddenly, the popular appeal of the ex-president seemed to be diminished. As the presidential election of 1912 approached, the philosophical differences in the Republican Party created an irreparable rift between progressives and traditional conservatives. Initially, Roosevelt was inclined to sit out the election, and still only in his 50s, figured that once Taft suffered an inevitable defeat, he could run for president in 1916. But having actually never really been comfortable with deciding against running for re-election in 1908, and observing how weak and unpopular Taft was, the ex-president gradually moved to confront the incumbent in an attempt to win the nomination. Initially, his campaign had great momentum, Roosevelt winning 9 of 13 primaries, but Taft and his supporters controlled the party machinery that dominated state caucuses and the Republican National Committee. Despite Roosevelt arriving in Chicago and the Republican convention with over 400 committed delegates of the 540 needed to win, backroom machinations by the RNC awarded Taft the delegates he needed to prevail. This process was so confrontational and bitter that Roosevelt eventually instructed his delegates to boycott the actual vote and then proclaimed that he would run for president as the head of a third party known as the Progressive Party. Roosevelt actually considered his Democratic opposition, New Jersey Governor Woodrow Wilson, the more formidable of his two opponents. During the presidential campaign of 1912, Roosevelt waged a typically spirited effort in which he decried a stolen nomination and espoused the fundamentals of his new nationalism platform. Wilson went even further, demanding that all trusts should be broken up, ending monopolies and restoring competition. Taft remained in the White House, his re-election campaign one of the most feeble in U.S. history. In an unusual election year, perhaps the most remarkable event occurred on October 14th in Milwaukee, when Theodore Roosevelt, emerging from his hotel en route to a nearby speech, was greeting supporters from the interior of his open-air automobile. A delusional, unemployed individual named John Schrank pushed his way to the front of the crowd and shot Roosevelt point blank with a Colt .38 pistol. The bullet traveled through Roosevelt's eyeglass case and his 50-page speech folded into his coat pocket. It then penetrated Roosevelt's rib cage and lodged in his upper body. Roosevelt momentarily staggered, but then calmly instructed the horrified crowd that he was all right, waving his hat to the relieved bystanders. Schrank was pummeled to the ground by bodyguards, and when a mob began to threaten him with a lynching, Roosevelt insisted that he be turned over to the custody of the police. The candidate repeatedly coughed deliberately, and seeing no blood, reasoned correctly that the bullet had not penetrated his lung. While members of his entourage insisted he immediately go to a hospital, he refused. Instead, he demanded to be taken to the Milwaukee Auditorium, the site of his speech. Although he agreed to be examined by doctors backstage, he refused their pleas that he cancel his speech and go instead to a hospital. He placed a handkerchief over the bullet hole, buttoned up his already blood-stained shirt, and made his way onto the stage, greeted by a thunderous ovation from thousands of spectators, the hall jammed to capacity. During his introduction, a local politician explained that Roosevelt had been shot, and some in the audience yelled that this was a fake. Roosevelt then made his way to the very front of the stage, and then asking for quiet, he calmly stated, "This is no fake," opening his jacket and revealing his blood-stained shirt, an unmistakable mark about 4 inches in diameter, eliciting gasps from the stunned audience. He then began his speech with the words, "I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose." He then spoke for 84 minutes. Several times, aides and assistants attempted to get him to stop, to no avail. Finally, with the words, "I appeal to you to join with us, to work, to fight, but with charity, with kindness, and with generosity, to bring about social and industrial justice," he concluded his speech. The crowd burst into another roar of approval and surged forward, forcing bodyguards and police to push their way through the throng and get the candidate out of the building. Removed to a nearby hospital, Roosevelt had the wound cleaned, and x-rays determined that a bullet was lodged near the rib cage, but otherwise harmless. Doctors made the decision to leave it there, where it remained for the rest of Theodore Roosevelt's life. His assassin, Schrank, was declared legally insane and spent the next 31 years at a mental institution, his motive anger over Roosevelt's perceived attempt to seek a third term. With Taft not even on the campaign trail, Woodrow Wilson, out of deference to the wounded ex-president, briefly suspended his campaign. Roosevelt fully recovered, and by October 30th was back campaigning, if only to demonstrate his physical fitness for the presidency. It did him little good. Although he put up the best third-party performance in U.S. political history, Theodore Roosevelt received only 88 electoral votes to Wilson's 435. Roosevelt received 27% of the popular vote to Wilson's 42%, Taft exhibiting the worst incumbent performance ever, winning only 2 states, 8 electoral votes, and 23% of the popular vote. That he had prevented Taft's re-election was of little consolation to the ex-president. He understood that the era of progressivism within the Republican Party was over, and with it probably his own national political ambitions. Roosevelt was deeply disappointed by the 1912 election results and essentially withdrew from the public for several months after the election. Eventually, he accepted an invitation for a South American lecture tour in Brazil, Chile, and Argentina, discoursing on various topics, including the future of U.S. and South American diplomacy. Accompanied by his wife, this fairly tame expedition bordered on tourism and lacked the level of challenge that the ex-president craved. Most likely, as a result, Roosevelt agreed to embark on an exploratory trek of the River of Doubt, a remote offshoot of the Amazon. Accompanied by his son Kermit and renowned Brazilian explorer Candido Rondon, another American naturalist, and 15 porters, it took 2 months of overland hiking merely to reach the headwaters of the River of Doubt. Using dugout canoes that were frequently damaged by rapids, traversing the 500-mile river proved extremely difficult, the expedition having to deal with insect infestation, malaria, and dysentery. They were also fortunate to escape violence at the hands of a local indigenous group known as the Cinta Larga, who visibly observed the expedition, could have easily wiped them out, but chose not to. 3 men died during the trek, and Roosevelt became so sick with both malaria and dysentery that he implored his son to leave him behind to die, a request that was ignored. It was not until April 26, 1914, that the expedition was able to meet up with a prearranged relief unit that helped get them out of this remote region and to much-needed medical care in the Brazilian city of Manaus. In tribute to this remarkable expedition, the river was renamed the Rio Roosevelt. 3 weeks later, the ex-president returned to the United States in May 1914, merely as a private citizen, his health permanently compromised. However, he still retained enough energy to compose Through the Brazilian Wilderness, a popular book that generated more money than his presidential salary. Within months, the events that plunged Europe into war became an American political football. President Wilson, understanding that an isolationist public was mostly unwilling to involve itself in what was considered a regional conflict, remained neutral, even after the May 1915 German sinking of the Lusitania, a British passenger ship that resulted in many hundreds of deaths, including over 120 Americans. Predictably, especially after the Lusitania incident, Roosevelt was highly critical of Wilson, and the seriousness of the global crisis prompted him to a half-hearted attempt at the Republican presidential nomination of 1916, an effort that went nowhere. The convention nominating New York Governor Charles Evans Hughes. Wilson ran on the eventually ironic slogan, "He kept us out of war," and won one of the narrowest presidential elections in U.S. history, a 3,000-vote plurality in California, putting him over the top. Within months, and after additional German naval aggression, the U.S. entered World War I. By then, Roosevelt had toned down his criticism of Wilson's previously pacifist policy, as he decided that he personally would organize and lead a volunteer force to assist the American war effort. Although he personally met with President Wilson, such a venture was immediately shot down within both the administration and the military. The idea of the bull moose Roosevelt rampaging across France at the head of archaic cavalry charges, a potential command structure nightmare no one wished to enable. The ex-president had to console himself with a vigorous 1980 war bond tour, investing a great deal of his own money in the effort. As the war wound down to a November 1918 armistice, and Wilson's stubborn attempt to continue U.S. international involvement through his proposed League of Nations fell flat, Republicans swept the 1918 off-year elections, once again propelling public and private discussions of a potential Theodore Roosevelt return to national stature in 1920. But such a prospect was unrealistic, the ex-president's deteriorating health alone precluding such a possibility. In late 1918, Roosevelt was already bedridden with an attack of what was then diagnosed as inflammatory rheumatism, most likely severe arthritis, and his various tropical ailments had left him severely debilitated. Additionally, he was also depressed over the death of his son, Quentin, killed in action over France in July of 1918 as a pilot. Although it was a shock to the public, it should not have been at all surprising when Theodore Roosevelt suddenly died in his sleep on January 6, 1919, at Sagamore Hill, from what has been described as a pulmonary embolism. All 4 of Theodore Roosevelt's sons served in the military in World War I. The aforementioned Quentin is the only son of a U.S. president to be killed in combat. His son Archibald Archie Roosevelt was wounded in 1918, severely enough to be declared 100% disabled. Would also be wounded during World War II, seriously enough to again be declared 100% disabled, the only U.S. combat soldier ever to receive such a designation twice. Theodore Roosevelt Jr. was wounded during World War I while serving on the Western Front and received the Distinguished Service Cross and the French Légion d'honneur for his service as a battalion commander. Unconventional like his father, in mid-1943, Roosevelt Jr. was relieved of his command as a brigadier general, as his propensity to actively engage in combat was viewed as inappropriate. When he repeatedly requested to be reinstated in a combat situation during the Normandy invasion, his commanding officer reluctantly assigned him to the first wave at Utah Beach. Roosevelt, the first general to come ashore on D-Day, June 6, 1944, brandishing a pistol and walking with a cane necessitated by both a heart condition and arthritis, Roosevelt Jr. sorted out the chaos in the landing zone, personally led several units to their appropriate inland positions, and continued to skillfully escort subsequent troops away from the beach, all the while ignoring artillery, landing close enough to douse him with dirt from head to toe. 36 days later, 56 years old, he died of a heart attack, having kept his condition a secret so as not to be removed from combat. Already slated to receive the Distinguished Service Cross, this was upgraded to the Medal of Honor. Theodore Roosevelt Jr. is buried next to his brother Quentin at the U.S. Military Cemetery at Colleyville-sur-Mer, overlooking the site of Normandy's Omaha beachhead. Kermit Roosevelt served in both World Wars I and II, but was not as distinguished as his three other brothers. Struggling with alcoholism and depression, he was assigned to a military post in Alaska, where he died, his death initially attributed to a heart attack, but ultimately revealed to be the result of suicide by gunshot. Even Roosevelt's two daughters, Ethel and Alice, felt compelled to public service. Ethel was actually the first Roosevelt to serve in France as a nurse. Subsequently, she devoted herself to various causes, including civil rights and the preservation of her family's historical legacy, especially the family residence at Sagamore Hill. Alice Roosevelt Longworth was a legendary high-profile Washington socialite and political influencer, but also well known for her acerbic wit. Her personality could probably be summarized by her frequently repeated comment, "If you can't say something good about someone, sit right here by me." Roosevelt's children embodied a spirit undoubtedly passed down from their remarkable father, a sentiment he described in a speech he gave at the Sorbonne in Paris on April 23, 1910, following his African safari. In part, he commented, "It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat." In 1927, as a means of increasing tourism in the state of South Dakota, lawmakers began plans to build a national monument at Mount Rushmore. After rejecting several ideas as to who this monument would commemorate, the planners decided to honor 4 U.S. presidents: Washington, Jefferson, Theodore Roosevelt, and Lincoln, honoring America's birth, growth, development, and preservation, respectively. Even in the late 20s, the Lakota tribe protested that the monument was built on stolen land and that the sculpture was an insult that memorialized individuals who had engaged in specific acts detrimental to the Lakotas themselves. Over time, Theodore Roosevelt's reputation has been tarnished by allegations of racist acts and words involving Black Americans, Asians and other immigrant populations, and even Germans during World War I. In 2022, a statue of Roosevelt that stood in front of New York's Museum of Natural History, an institution co-founded by the president's father, was removed. The memorial, which also contained both a Native American and African warrior, was classified as a literal description of a racial hierarchy. Like many of his historical contemporaries, Theodore Roosevelt's legacy has become extremely complicated. Still, the many accomplishments of his incredible life cannot be denied. As former governor of the state of New York and President of the United States, Medal of Honor recipient, first American Nobel laureate, founder of the American Progressive Political Movement, conservationist, executor of the Panama Canal, and best-selling author of numerous publications, Roosevelt remains the epitome of the man in the arena. Thank you for listening to part 2 of this podcast about Theodore Roosevelt. Information for this podcast came from the books The Theodore Roosevelt Biographical Trilogy by Edmund Morris, When Trumpets Call, Theodore Roosevelt After the White House by Patricia O'Toole, and Theodore Roosevelt and the Assassin by Gerard Helfrich. There are also additional photographs, bibliographical, and musical information at someveryfamouspeople.com. If you have enjoyed this presentation, please like us at our Facebook page, Some Very Famous People, and follow us on Twitter at Philip D. Gibbons. Subscribe to my YouTube page at Noblesse Oblige, and please note that all of Bite-Sized biographies are now available on YouTube and YouTube Music. And please tell a friend about Bite-Sized biographies.